When Meghan Markle first joined the British royal family, a lot of people said she was a breath of fresh air. And let's be honest, I felt she was. There she was, apparently, a sort of beautiful young lady who basically was going to, well, had a brand new dimension to the British monarchy. And what we felt and what we saw was, given the fact that our late and brilliant monarch, Queen Elizabeth II, was willing to bend the rules and allow Meghan, of course, to attend Christmas and seemingly do things that Catherine, the Princess of Wales, was not allowed to do for many years. Well, this was a brand new remodernised monarchy. That was so important. But a lot of people say, well, why didn't they look further into this? Now, here's the problem. You see, MI5 and MI6 would have definitely done a very thorough investigation job on Meghan Markle. Everything from where she went to school, literally. If they had not, then she would not have been allowed so closely in. But according to a source that was working literally within the royal family at that moment in time, you see, Her Majesty the Queen was very, very difficult for her because obviously she knew the ongoing health battles of her husband, His Royal Highness Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. And she was really, concerned behind the scenes about that. Plus, she was trying to carry on in the role that she dedicated her life to for so many years. And never wanting to share her own hardships, she clearly felt she couldn't do this because she knew people were going through far worse than her. That was her generation. That's how she dealt with things. Now, according to sources, there were a couple of red flags. But here's where it gets really interesting, because whenever these were broached up, of course, with Prince Harry, he kind of flew off the handle because for him, he'd found the perfect woman. And once again, he felt that this chance of happiness, this moment that he'd been longing for years, the fact that he wanted to now settle down, he'd been moved out of the army, even though he didn't want to, if you remember. And now, of course, the chance where he felt there was some area of happiness for himself, well, this was the problem. And if people wanted to attack him for that, then he certainly jumped on that bandwagon. You see, the problem was that the Queen, dare I say, was a little bit, shall we say, worried about how to placate Harry on many different occasions because he was very vocal. He'd already got into trouble, all thanks to things like the Nazi armband and, of course, stripping off in Las Vegas. But it was sort of statements like this on television where he basically claimed, literally to the world, well, nobody wants to be the Queen or King. No, nobody wants that job. Which again made, well, so it appears, people ungrateful for the privilege of what they've been given. And at the time, she did her very best, but she knew that Harry was a totally different character to Prince William. William was more staid, more directional, and kind of knew the destiny. Harry, as he pointed out in his book, was simply the spare. And he felt that he could get away with things that perhaps his elder brother William couldn't. And in a way, this was true. Hence the reason when Meghan Markle came barging through the doors, and we know her story now, of course, of how apparently she charmed Her Majesty the Queen and basically said, the corgis loved her, everybody thought she was terrific, and Harry, as the Queen pointed out, could have been just a little bit too in love. But behind the scenes, things were not all what they seemed. You see, what really gets interesting is, according to that source, there were a couple of highlights presented to senior members and senior courtiers. But according to them, they were brushed away, seemingly because it would have been very difficult for the Queen, or indeed any senior member of the monarchy. The rumblings already were the fact that Meghan had reinvented herself, not at this point as Nigerian, but as a woman of colour. And as we'd seen, it was a very difficult time. The times were a-changing. Now, as we all know, Meghan Markle was not the first lady of colour to enter the British monarchy. But of course, she seized on this particular opportunity and more importantly, made sure that Harry knew some of the hardships that she'd gone through before. But then what really turned out was all thanks to her father being very vocal and of course her half-sister. Well, apparently there were no problems in Meghan's life before, but clearly she was spinning this particular story. And that's the true reason behind the fact that Queen Elizabeth was so soft on Harry. And it was a moment, of course, that he could really play on. Each time he arranged for Meghan to try and meet the Queen, he would very much well verse her on the likes and dislikes of the monarch. So it seems strange to think, doesn't it, that he was quite well keen to verse her on that area of life, but apparently she had to Google the words to the national anthem, and she didn't know anything about royal protocol. So why did he only focus on that? But as we then found out, this happened. This picture did not go down well with the former royal known as the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle. And on reflection, when you look at it, there it is, they've just married. They're leaving St. George's Chapel in the very heart of Windsor. A beautiful sunny day, a lot of goodwill to this brand new royal couple. And one would have thought that she should just be basking in absolute sheer happiness. She's found her prince and life's moving forward. But as ever with Meghan, there was a bigger picture behind this particular picture. As ever, let me explain. Morning, good to see you, and thank you so much as ever for joining me for a brand new episode of By Royal Appointment. Can I just thank everybody for getting involved in the last one? It really means a lot because obviously I put a lot of work into these, and I'd like you to know the stories that I find out for you that I can share with you actually by verification and speaking to the people that were there at the time. I think that's so important, when you actually find people that are in the area or have literally worked at that point for them, then at least you get their perspective. And I've met everybody from assistants to our late monarch to, of course, former servants, former employees, and they tell you their version of events. Now, that's not to say it's the definitive version, but what you get is their perspective on what happened when they're there. And that really is so important. That's the whole point of By Royal Appointment. It's looking at situations by the stories that naturally, as many people have realised, have been put together by people who in the media at the time were literally gushing and willing to write anything to keep these people on board. But of course, in the fullness of time, as our late brilliant Queen Elizabeth II said, well, things change, don't they? Now, this particular thing changed, as you can see, because there you have this wonderful, glorious picture of the newly married couple descending the steps from St. George's Chapel. And you would have thought that really, you can see from looking at everybody, Camilla, of course, Doria Raglan standing there with His Majesty the King, or the Prince of Wales as he was then. And let's not forget, this is a man that really has broken quite a bit of royal tradition at that point by escorting, that's right, his son's future wife halfway down the aisle on her insistence, simply because her own father tragically suddenly became too ill. Well, that's the story, And I think that must have really hurt Thomas Markle, because whether he wanted to or not, it's a big moment. Even though, of course, this was her second time down the aisle, this was a totally different marriage, as it were. And the cameras, the world were looking at your daughter, a person that you've nurtured and made sure you've given the very best in life to. And the biggest moment that should have been together was whipped away from you. Through, really, some might suggest, no fault of your own. The true story of that, as I told you previously, apparently will only come out now in the fullness of time. Sadly, perhaps, well, you know what I'm saying. But back to this picture. What do you notice? Well, as I said, it's nice, isn't it? But behind the scenes, according to a very well-placed source, Meghan was absolutely furious. Now, on the descending of the steps, you can see that she just looks, very much the poised, elegant person that she's tried to become. An actress. She acted all the way through that, How she kept that glaze going for so long when the pastor was speaking, I don't know, but she did. Now, apparently what really upset both Harry and Meghan behind the scenes was the fact that actually she felt, as ever, allegedly, all eyes should be on her and Harry. This was their moment. What were they doing? Talking to each other, laughing, looking away. Now, this is somebody clearly who wanted to choreograph and stage manage every single aspect of that particular moment. And as we saw and we heard, did we not, Meghan at the time apparently didn't like the musty smell of the centuries-old chapel, so decided that she wanted it all spraying with a certain fragrance in advance. Very wisely and tactfully, people might suggest, Her Majesty the Queen basically said no. But these are the things that you can't control. Now, the true story behind that is that, yes, it was a boiling hot day. They just sat through a very long service. And there is, of course, Prince Charles just making very pleasant chit-chat with her mother, who, let's not forget, has been forced to sit on her own, literally on her own throughout the service. And according to that source, Charles felt very sorry for her, just couldn't believe that she'd not even brought a companion alongside. But apparently, according to that source, this particular picture was already starting to become a real bone of contention for Meghan Markle. When you report on the royals, you get a fuller perspective of the sort of people that they are. And it never really sort of shocks me in the least to find out that, well, the worst offender really is none other than the former royal Meghan Markle, seemingly because she came to the royal family with a ruthlessness that had never truly been seen before. She's often compared, let's not forget, to the other American, that was Wallis Simpson. But as I've told you in previous sort of videos and things, Wallis wasn't really out for fame or anything like that. She was literally just in the social circle. That's what people did back then. Meghan seems to have come with a totally different agenda. One we very famously saw when she sat down for that orchestrated reality with Michelle Hussein. The only person that seemingly could not see through this was none other than Prince Harry. But as we also know, and has been pointed out on a number of occasions, the late Queen Elizabeth realised that Harry was simply besotted. And if you remember, his words himself was, "Look what I got," as if it was some kind of charity prize that he'd won in a raffle. Sometimes, it's not always worth keeping the raffle prizes though, is it? And that's the problem. But you see, moving forward, when you look at it, you cannot believe just how many times this former royal Meghan has been, well, sort of just disingenuous, rude, unkind, and downright cruel. You see, when you think about it and you look back at different situations, even at the birth of Prince Archie, there was a mockiness to that particular announcement, if you remember. There she was, billed as the Duchess of Sussex, and under occupation, she put Princess of the United Kingdom. And it's fascinating, isn't it, to think that she was laughing and mocking at that, because as she pointed out to a colleague, what is all this about kings and queens and princesses and dragons and stuff like that? This is ridiculous. It's not medieval times. So she clearly wasn't taking it seriously. Yes, to the outside world, it does look slightly ridiculous. We still have a king and a queen. But when you look at the stellar work they do, whether you like or agree with them or not, you can understand the value that they bring literally to the United Kingdom, the Commonwealth and the world. We saw that recently, did we not, when, of course, the incoming president, Donald Trump, only really wanted to meet Prince William. You can understand the power of that. When you also look at Lilibet's birth certificate, of course, she put down occupation as nothing. So there was this woman being, this incredible person, talking about your seat at the table and get your voice be heard, but she was quite willing to just say, actually, I'm nothing. Maybe she should have put down jam maker, who knows? But it was an absolute cruelty to His Majesty the King that really you can't get over, because let's not forget, here is a man that didn't have to do this very generous offer of walking the bride-to-be halfway down the aisle at St. George's Chapel in Windsor. And what was fascinating about that particular thing is, she was very insistent that it just had to be halfway. And Charles wanted to be very accommodating and, again, being very kind towards his youngest son, fully agreed. He didn't have to do it at all. She could have simply walked down there herself. But apparently Meghan asked Harry, would he mind? She didn't even have the manners or courtesy to go and ask him herself. Again, fascinating stuff. But the biggest slap in the teeth has to be the fact that, of course, whether you realise it or not, His Majesty the King has only actually met his granddaughter Lily once. Just the once, right? And here's where it gets even more interesting, because according to sources, there aren't any up-to-date pictures. Apparently, on a visit, Harry showed pictures of the children to the King. But apparently because of Meghan's screaming security, they weren't allowed to be left or indeed given over. Quite what King Charles would do with these, well, is a bit of a bafflement, isn't it? But then she waited for the biggest slap in the teeth to a man that's been nothing but kind to her, bestowing a title upon her and her children. And that's when she decided on May the 6th in 2023 that, well, basically she wasn't going to come along, of course, to his coronation. And the reason being is, well, this was the birthday of her son, Archie. Yes, the son that the king had given that title to, Prince Archie, a title that meant nothing to her, and she didn't necessarily agree with them. You get where this is going. Now, where it gets really interesting, as ever, digging a little bit deeper and speaking to the people that were working alongside them at the time, this is what happened. Imagine you're His Majesty the King and you've got a lot on. Let's be honest, the world is going to be looking at you at Westminster Abbey, and this is your shining moment, one that's going to go down in history, and literally, as I say, everything's going to be picked apart. But the niggling thing behind your back is this, yes, right, this woman who apparently is still waiting, very much so, for something of a public apology. And this was backed up, of course, by his youngest son. Now, as I've said to you before, they didn't know what the public apology was, but condescendingly, this was going to be the holdout thing. And what Meghan really wanted was this public apology really to be prefixed against the coronation. You see how this works. Once again, bringing the light and the shining onto her, taking it away from a major historical event. Now, as we all know, that wasn't forthcoming. There wasn't even a discussion about it. Quite how Harry portrayed this back, and as ever, allegedly, to Meghan remains to be seen. But the bottom line was, it wasn't happening. Now, moving forward, where it gets even more interesting is that, she was still in an and she saw the value of would she come, wouldn't she come, all of that sort of stuff. And this was played out in the media. Now, what was fascinating was there was no apology at all from her missing this very important historical event. She didn't write him a letter, one of those calligraphy letters or anything like that. She didn't detail why she wasn't coming. That was left, of course, to her husband, Prince Harry. Now, as we know, he turned up like some sullen, sulky child in a rented Dior suit that was then monetized literally on, of course, Twitter and social media platforms, degrading the whole situation down to the very last moment. And of course, very much being pictured rushing back to make sure that the media saw where his priorities lie, running back to an out-of-work D-list actress and, of course, his children. Nothing wrong with that, I would say, but not even the courtesy to hang around long enough to have a drink, a piece of cake, a congratulatory, whatever. This is simply because there was no apology. Now, when you think about it like that, Meghan must be some kind of piece of work to walk away from an historical event. I, for one, was stunned that she didn't want to turn up and have the spotlight on her. But again, talking to staff who are now no longer, in the NDA situation, apparently she wanted to know where would she be going to be sitting, and more importantly, where would the cameras be, etc. Now, many people were totally relieved when this didn't happen, as one can imagine, because nobody wanted the circus that now is Harry and Meghan that we've seen recently with the LA fires. And it's fascinating to think, is it not, that when you also look at it, if she had have turned up, they would have done something to make sure that it was all about Meghan. And Harry really facilitates this. He's desperate to please this woman. Doesn't matter what she does. Basically, whatever she wants, yes, she can get. That was then. Things have radically changed over the last sort of few months now, and obviously even Harry can see that things are not working out with the plan that she'd come up with. And make no mistake about it, it was genuinely her plan. So moving forward, when people say, well, what happened? Well, His Majesty the King never got an apology from either. Yes, his youngest son did turn up and, as I say, sulked around for a few hours and then disappeared, making the focus on him back at Heathrow. And Meghan, well, no, didn't have the courtesy or manners, according to that source, and as ever, allegedly, to even write a letter or a congratulatory card. But then again, how would you get out of that? And then also, why would you bother when it's all about you? There's always more to learn, and the inside tracks of really how Meghan Markle has lured Prince Harry in to basically make a very strange world that they now live in. And seemingly, as that world crumbles around them, well then, there's always more to report. But as I said, you see, behind the scenes, there's also people ready to speak who are literally disgusted at the way that they've conducted themselves so far since exiting the British monarchy. Of all the things that the former royal known as Meghan Markle actually did to the British monarchy, and also directed to our late monarch Queen Elizabeth II, was truly this. It was an instance really that left everybody gasping inside Buckingham Palace, simply because many knew this to be an absolute outright lie. But then time and time again we've seen Meghan Markle with her own fixated version of the truth. Oprah Winfrey kind of coined it, didn't she? And a lot of people didn't realise that in effect she was basically saying, this is your truth. A truth that Meghan had decided was going to be her version of events, regardless of the truth or not. But you see, once Meghan had got her grips inside the monarchy, as I told you before, she really just wanted to monetize things. She wanted to grab control, force people into situations. If you didn't want to do that, didn't bend to her way, didn't capitulate, then of course you were an enemy. And there were many of those. Of course, like many people who want control, she had kind sides. Apparently, she once hired an ice cream van to arrive inside Windsor Castle for some of the hard-working staff. But really, by this point, a lot of people had had enough. And the bottom line truly was they didn't really care much for a 99 Cornetto or anything from Meghan. They just wanted out. This, as I've said throughout many of these instances with stories, is the reoccurring theme for people now that are willing to speak up, because literally they know the truth. You see, when you cast your mind back, of course, to the TV presenter that sadly was let go by ITV, simply because he didn't believe Meghan's versions of events, well, that's how powerful she was. And you have to take your mind back to this particular period in 2019. This was for the South African tour. This was the one, of course, where Archie's nursery got on fire and, you know, the sort of thing. And obviously that wasn't as dramatic as everybody was led to believe. It was a fire way down the corridor, but, you know, details don't necessarily matter to someone like Lamarckle, you understand. It's all about the graphic headline. But it was this very much staged conversation with the ITV reporter Tom Bradbury. And what was interesting here was this particular documentary had been assigned by ITV to follow the couple round. And there were so many inaccuracies in that, but of course Meghan was directing it all from the sidelines. She decided her version of events were the one that was going to come out. But just to give you some perspective, Meghan claimed that this was a grueling tour and left them both exhausted. And when both Harry and Meghan were interviewed by Oprah Winfrey, when they sat down, Harry's main gripe was the fact that, well, you know, they'd come back from this successful tour and nobody said how well they'd done, how hard they'd worked, what great ambassadors they were. But just how hard was it really? So here's a bit of a perspective. You see, the South African tour was from September the 22nd to October the 2nd. In that 10 days, she had just 14 engagements. But that really wasn't a lot in many respects, because some of these engagements were very, very short indeed, to accommodate the fact that she was expecting her first child. It's interesting, you see, because the ones that she got excited about were meeting Bishop Desmond Tutu, Mandela's widow, and an audience with the South African president. However, take note that there were simply no engagements at all on the 27th, 28th or 29th. So to say that this was exhausting is a bit of a stretch. I mean, let's be brutally blunt here. But of course, you know, in Meghan's world with the fake fire and stuff like that, naturally things had to be different. Now, where it really upset Her Majesty the Queen was that very much staged conversation with Tom, where if you remember, he said, you know, how are you? How are you feeling? Oh, thank you for asking. Clicking very much into acting mode and making sure there was a little smudge of mascara underneath, wide-eyed, and as I told you in a previous video, now looking at Tom's forehead, right? Making sure that her eyes remain wide open on camera. Thank you for asking. Not a lot of people have asked that. And then she goes on to say what a struggle it was, and hands in the pockets, slouching, looking exhausted. That's simply not true. You see, according to people working there, all the time they checked in on Meghan time and time again. If anything, she seemed buoyant and very much sort of, you know, enjoying the moment. She seemed to like the fact that when the public came out to see her and were screaming her name. Never once did she complain about not feeling well or, you know, not feeling her very best. And in fact, there was no problem with the behind the scenes story regarding the fire and the staff, right? Now, here's where it gets really interesting, because, of course, when she came back and she reiterated that story yet again to other individuals, the staff were then brought in to ask exactly, well, who was looking after poor Meghan? Now, they recited back that, well, poor Meghan, every time they asked, was told, no, Meghan's fine, Prince Harry is looking after her. What Meghan really wanted to do, and the real sort of motivation behind this new line of narrative, she wanted to get very close to Queen Elizabeth. She wanted to be the one that could bypass the likes of, say, a Courtier, Angela Kelly, people like that. So basically, she had a direct contact with the most powerful woman in the world, and in particular with inside the royal family. Meghan, then she felt, according to that source, and as ever we have to say allegedly, felt that this was the idea where she could sit down with the Queen and talk about how she could rebrand, monetize, and change the whole concept of the British monarchy. Now, time and time again, she requested that she wanted to meet with the Queen privately. And time again, it was never really, well, possible. Two reasons. The Queen, as we know, was in the very early stages herself of suffering from bone cancer. And the other side of the coin was people around Her Majesty the Queen were all much very aware of exactly what Meghan Markle's plan was. You know, she'd already said, I would do things differently. So they knew. Now, to pick on a vulnerable elder person and hope that you could twist, well, the story round to your way of thinking doesn't bear thinking about, really, does it? But the other side of the coin is that's exactly what Meghan Markle planned to do. But as ever, even with the backing of her good friend, who asked her that question while looking wide-eyed and innocent, thank you for asking, nobody's bothered to ask. It's simply not true. Many people were concerned about Meghan Markle within the British monarchy, and some might say for many different reasons. Either way, a plan once again was foiled. Neil Sean in the very heart of London.